I'll make it right again, but it's no use, you said. And my hunger grows and grows. I have to write the meaning of my life, or else everything's in vain. When the glory tries to tempt you, it may seem like what you need. But if glory makes you happy, why are you so broken up? So tell me how it felt when you walked on water. Did you get your wish? Floating to the surface quicker than you sank. I know. So tell me how it felt when you walked on water. Did you get your wish? Floating to the surface quicker than you sank. I know.
Hey everyone, happy Wednesday to you. Hope you all are having a Gundam great day. Courtesy of Johnny Tacoma in chat. Good to see you all. Welcome to Midnight Hatter Live, the weekly variety show where we talk Gundam, gaming, and Gunpla. I'm of course your host, Steven, aka Midnight Hatter, and joining me as always is the Gundam explainer, Adam Blue. How are you, sir?
Hey, doing good, especially because I'm telling you guys, Nin game, like I had pre-ordered and I'll just show them because I'm playing with them right here. The Blue Destiny Robot Spirits, and it was to be released in June, and like I can't believe how fast it got here. Right? It like got here in
Yeah.
time for me to shoot and edit a video that went up today on the Unit 2, which just looks cool. So
Yeah, if you guys haven't seen it, definitely go check out that video after the stream because
yeah.
first of all, I mean, y- you've given me an appreciation of robot spirits that I
Oh,
didn't have before just through your reviews and seeing like the articulation and the detail and the care that's put into these figures. But also, hey, I think that that is a pretty sweet looking Xeon Gundam. Like as far as
yes.
Xeon Gundams go, and so let me ask you this. Do you think that the Blue Destiny Unit 2 would be a difficult to modify kit slash figure if you wanted to make the Rust Gundam from Rust
Oh,
Horizon?
W excellent idea. In fact, that would probably be the best. I haven't looked at it in a while. I think even Kyle did a video recently on it, or just
Yeah.
yesterday or something. Yeah, it would just be a matter of that V-fin.
Yeah, just taking off
Yeah.
the half of like honestly, the V-fin on it, it's been a while since I've seen the Rust Gundam, but it's like kind of got like a Gundam Shenlong or Ultron shape
Yeah.
to it. Like it's a very
It's like the other
it's
side's
not like a straight V-fin. It's
right.
like got some jagged edges to it.
That's a
Um
great idea, actually. I mean, I would think that looks great for a kit. Maybe that's in the making. Like, I would think that would be an obvious thing, like, make a kit of this, but,
yeah,
be a good custom too. Yeah.
and if you guys haven't checked it out, there was that Gundam conference yesterday where they
Oh,
announced
yeah.
that there's the, they're moving the life-size Gundam.
Yeah, to a new area, I guess they're gonna have for it.
Yeah, I think it's Osaka
Okay. Yeah, I
somewhere.
remember seeing there like a pavilion or something, I forget what they were calling it, and then they were just
Yeah, like the
showing.
next future pavilion.
Yeah, exactly.
It's very cool. Honestly, the design of the Gundam, like with the kind of glowing plates, I don't know how I feel about that, but and then they also announced, some stuff regarding Requiem for Vengeance and Seed Freedom. The Zaku from Seed Free or not Zaku, Zigok from Seed Freedom that they
I
showed
love it.
is it's so goofy looking, but I love it.
I
It's
know, that's what's cool with Seed Freedom is, like, I do like those designs, and I wonder if, like, it's like they know they're coming out with a new Seed movie, but let's really make these designs have UC stuff to it to get those fans too, because
yeah.
like,
Now
in
oh, go ahead.
oh, sorry, one thing I wanted to mention real quick about the life-size Gundam is I think they keep messing it up because it's like, just make it look literally,
You
like
just
the old
want a
ones.
one-to-one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah, which, it could be part of making it, and they hire someone to design it, and they just wanna, add their own flair, so I get it.
Right, yeah,
Something
there's
else to
always
sell.
and isn't that part of the appeal of, like, the Hajime Katoki line? Like, it's like, "Oh,
Yeah.
well, this is Katoki's interpretation of this old, UC design."
Right.
And Jam X here in chat says the pose is terrible, which I have to agree, like, at what point in any of the Gundam series did the Granddaddy Gundam just, like, get on one knee and I don't know.
Yeah, usually if it's doing that, the hand is going down to maybe allow someone to get like a functional pose.
Which that would be kind of cool because if
Oh,
they
yeah, well,
actually did allow people to, like, climb into the hand to take pictures,
that's a great idea. Because I know,
charge
like,
20
even
bucks for people to go get their picture taken with the Gundam,
yeah,
like
I remember there was this police station near me a long time ago. They had, like, this day to, go up there and little festival thing, I don't know. Anyway, I was with my daughter at the time, and they had this little, bucket thing that you can go in, and it lifts you up really high, and it's like they could just make that the hand, and then
yeah.
it lifts you up, and that'd be neat.
See, and it's an excellent fundraiser because, like you said, if it's something that they do at, like, the fire station, I'm sure that that's, like, a fundraising part of
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point, yeah.
But on the subject of Gunpla, I'm sure you guys are wondering how I am progressing on this guy, our RE100 Bawu that's going into that competition in July. I have to
Man.
say, this was such a fun build, like, and I was worried that I wasn't going to be able to use the built-in hands in order to power the beam sabers. But what I noticed is that, and this is a testament to the RE100 design department, right? I keep praising the RE100 line. It uses like the high grade gimmick of having like a tab in the hand for the weapons to clip into, right?
Yeah.
And so, what perfect opportunity for me to install the metal pins that are going to connect via magnets. I just put it on.
Oh.
If I run the wire through the backside of the hand, you can actually see the hole
Oh, yeah.
where the weapon would be mounted. So we can actually just run the wire from there and put the magnets in the back of the hand. The clip goes in and the beam saber lights up. And that
Yeah.
even gives us potential to light up the beam rifle too, if we wanted to have, like, a light
Oh,
in the lens.
that would be cool. Yeah, yeah, you're really selling it. I mean, I agree. I like RE100s, but they look good. Like, that model kit looks great, but then it has that extra space. And it's a little easier to modify because it's not compounded with a bunch of little parts.
And I think it contributes to the ease of the transformation. Like, the switching it into the attacker and nutter is so much easier than trying to transform, like, my master grade Zeta, like
Oh, yeah, that's a good point too. I need to check that out. Yeah, I'm gonna
but
try to grab one.
yeah, I might actually we'll see what happens later on tonight. I might actually stream some parts of, building this guy out. We'll
Oh,
see.
yeah, that'd be cool.
But until then, today's topic, we haven't talked about video game design and, video game philosophy in a while. So you guys are going to have to sit through Adam and I being pretentious about video games for a while.
Which, hey, I think people enjoy it.
I like to think so. And I have to say, shout out to you because you inspired today's topic with
Yes.
your conversation yesterday. If you guys haven't, Adam streams every morning over on Blue Gamer, which I wish I'd linked it down below because yesterday's stream, we talked about, or well, you talked about, that Sony is bringing PS3 titles to PS5,
Yeah.
which is something that, you've talked about backwards compatibility. And, it got me thinking about what was very appealing about the PS3 in general. And there was so many narrative driven games on the PS3 and not just like straightforward action adventure games that happened to have a story, but they were very they put the player in control of the narrative. And we're going to, kind of dissect that and talk about what that means. I saw over on Twitter today um Zeonic Shadow was responding to Sony because they had like a list of all the logos from the PS1 to the PS5. And I commented back because, the PS1 logo is so dynamic. It's got like the 3D
Yeah.
TV, yeah. And then the PS2 had like the blue and like kind of had that angular font.
Yeah.
PS3 very much like streamlined that. But ever since then, PS4 and 5 are basically the same logo as the PS3, but with a different number.
Yeah, I think they're, utilizing, like, the Spider-Man font,
Yeah.
like, that got they utilized that after the Sam Raimi movies, and I think since then they've kept with that because I it's crazy how much I think Sony banks on Spider-Man being synonymous with their
With
products.
so
Both
yeah.
their movies, they own the Spider-Man rights, and they do that, and the video games, they
Yep.
have the exclusive so that is
Because that
interesting.
Spider-Man 2 video game on PS5 is, like, everybody loves that, right? Um,
Yeah, I mean, I got it, and I haven't played it too much because it was just more of the same, but that might get into what we're gonna talk about here because
which I think
yeah.
that's basically what I commented back to Xeonic Shadows. I was like, "You can tell the exact year when Sony stopped innovating because the PS4 and PS5 logos are the exact same." It's like but to your point, it's like the Spider-Man game, it's like you said, it's more of the same. Like, they stopped kind of
Yeah,
pushing the boundaries, so to speak, on those types of games. And some of that's the market. You and I have talked a lot about, like,
yeah,
live service games and multiplayer games where people don't necessarily care about narrative and story, right?
yeah.
But I think that the fact that PS3 games are coming to PS5 and that there seems to be this push, you were just talking about it today on Blue Gamer, all these remakes and
Okay.
re-releases of old titles. We're getting the new Metal Gear Solid Delta, which is a remake of Metal Gear Solid 3. So it's like there's clearly something there that isn't just nostalgia. People are craving something from games in the past that we're not getting from games of the present. Would you agree with that?
I would, and I
Well,
bet
and
there
that's an unfair question because I know you're a big retro gamer, and I know
yeah.
it's not
No,
just because they're handhelds.
no, but this is a good thought, and I'll say it comes from the ideas as I go into the future when people ask, "What are your favorite games?" It's a lot of times I'm actually replacing old games with new games because
Mhm.
there are some new games that then replace what we have from the past, but then there's a lot of old games too that do something that then are missing from modern games, and I
Yeah.
think, that's part of it. Um,
Yeah, and so part of what I wanted to talk about today, and again, we're gonna get real pretentious. We're gonna start talking about ludo narratives and all that stuff that became popular to talk about in the
mm,
later half of the 2010s. You know, one of the things that I've been doing a lot of is playing through Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zeroes again, just like playing through every single mission over and over and over again. And there is this design philosophy that Koji Pro uses, and of course, it's gonna be like they applied a pretentious term to something that probably has been done by a lot of different game designers, but it is a trademark of Hideo Kojima games, which is the multi-process story. So this is something that applies to narrative games, but it's not the same thing as saying like, "Oh, well, it's like a choose your own adventure type thing."
yeah.
Because the decisions that the player makes in these narrative games don't affect the story so much as they affect the context of how you perceive the story to be.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting concept because I think even an individuals might not get the same out of it,
Yeah.
because of the context. And to maybe kind of paint an example of that, because I think this is a big deal we don't talk about too much in games. Is I was actually having this conversation with my wife yesterday. Like, I don't like to watch Pixar or Disney, like kids or family stuff. And I did when I was younger, but as I grew up, I started feeling, and again, this is just a personal thing. I
Yeah.
started feeling like, um, okay, it's asking me to cry,
Yeah,
but
that's step
I
1.
I'm not in some sort of like in my reality in some sort of survival state where that is required. So then when I feel it, I feel like it's an unearned and an unnecessary heightened emotional state that's usually
Very
reserved for
interesting.
survival. Yeah. So, and it's the same thing with music. If music sounds sad, I don't like to listen to it because again, it evokes emotions of me feeling a way. It's like, well, I'm not needed to be that way. And I think games do that for me too.
Yeah. So now if I can push back on that
Yeah.
for a moment, you do enjoy horror movies though, don't you?
That's a good point. I do, but I've also realized how infrequently I actually watch them. A
Yeah.
lot of them is from the past, you know, the
Because the same
movies.
sort of sensation, right? Where it's like
It
you have
is.
this you experience this heightened sense of, anxiety and
And
fear.
dread and fear, and actually, in a good example in the way where I feel it's earned and I like it, has to do with The Boys and Homelander.
Mm.
That fear, it's more of I am engaging in these dynamic relationships, and I'm just watching, feeling bad for the person, like, "Oh my god, Homelander's gonna do something." Like, you and he's the most power, like, that I feel I earned because it's more of I'm seeing, you know, I don't know, something you wouldn't normally see. You're a
Right.
superhero, you know, and
It kinda reminds me of those social experiments whenever, like, they'll, like, fake a robbery or something just to see how many people would react to the situation. Like, how many people would try to
oh,
intervene, how many people would, sometimes I feel like those things are done, for cynical reasons
yeah,
to point out, like, people's hypocrisy, but to your point, I think that sensation that I don't think that inaction means that you don't feel anything. Like, if you saw someone getting robbed on the street, you might not necessarily intervene, but that doesn't mean that you're not feeling something about it. You're not feeling that sense of injustice. And so, yeah, I think that television, movies, video games, they give us that opportunity to put ourselves in that situation where we're removed from uh the sort of shackles of civilized society where we can
yeah.
behave in ways that we might not do in real life. But, of course, then that kinda begs the question, like, why are there so many, like, murder hobos in video games? Like, people that'll just it's like playing GTA, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
there's that other side where I think there is some built-in, um, desires that we are just not having to act on, and I think some of that is
yeah.
aggression of self-defense. Like, we don't have to do that nowadays, but sometimes people do just because they don't know, it's like they don't know how to react in a situation just because, you know, they haven't been taught, and a lot of our history has to do with, you know, physical aggression as a defense mechanism. So playing a video game allows us to sometimes get that out because we're actually physically and mentally engaging with something, and yeah, I think that's a way to get that out. Oh,
Yeah, and I think that kinda goes to where the sort of design philosophy behind this multi-process story, approach where like I said, there's certain games that kind of try to challenge you, with like that ludonarrative dissonance. What's that game where it's like you're basically playing as the bad guy the whole time? Um,
Braid?
actually, the Braid is my favorite example of like the ludonarrative because and for those of you who don't know, like ludonarrative is when the story of the game is told through the mechanics of the game as opposed to just being a story that's played alongside the actual game. And so when you think about the theme of like Braid, you have the main character is trying to undo this great wrong, right?
Yeah.
But throughout the game, your ability to rewind time doesn't actually allow you to change what you did in that time that you're rewinding. So what's interesting about that is it reinforces this idea that he can't take back the thing that he did. And so, even though he has this power of rewinding time, if you notice, it's like when you rewind time, you're always gonna, like, follow the same arc that you followed when you jumped. So it's not like you can undo something, but you can't, like, redo it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I don't know
That
if
is
I'm articulating that well enough.
No, that does make sense, and that is a really neat thing about Braid, and in fact, yeah, I don't yeah, and it's funny because I feel like once I found out, and this just reminds me of The Last of Us, that the narrative is intertwined in the gameplay that much. Sometimes when that's revealed to me, I'm like, "Ah, okay." And I don't know what that is. I don't know if that, I feel like maybe there's a ceiling that occurs when the gameplay is tied into the narrative. It's like, "Oh, okay, so it's not like a toolbox." You know, this is, you know, it's like more of a linear, this is how you do it to discover what this is about.
See, and I think that that's where the multi-process story takes what a lot of people would consider like a choose your own adventure, and it's like no, the narrative happens regardless of what the player does. Like the story is always going to play out exactly the same. But like for instance, in a game like Ground Zeroes, there are so many missions that as you're playing through them, there are things that you can do that change how you perceive what you've done. So like for instance, there is, one mission where you have to, like, find a CIA mole and interrogate him, and then he tells you where this cassette tape is, and you just your job is just go get the cassette tape and leave. But if you choose to do something different, you'll find that if you follow him back to his patrol route, he meets with a handler that tells him that they were lying to you and that they were telling you to go get a fake tape when the real tape is on the guy that he was interviewing. And that's something like a completely optional thing. It doesn't change what you have to do in order to complete the mission and complete the story, but it gives you this whole other like, wait a second, how am I supposed to know what's true? Because it's not like it was told to you, by some character saying like, "Hey, make sure you go follow that guy because he's got secret information that you don't know about."
Yeah, and that reminds me of what Souls games do because again, it's completely optional. But in a Souls game, if you're at the right place at the right time, you might run into a character and then you're starting their quest line. Now,
Yeah,
this might give you better stuff for the game, but a lot of times it doesn't matter because it could be where a character ends up dying, an
yeah,
NPC ends up dying that could have been saved, but that doesn't matter for the end game. But it's almost like it gives you options. Like you could be on an objective in a Souls game and then meet a character, you realize, okay, there's something else unfolding that could lead to something. Sometimes it might lead to a boss or new gear or something. And I think Souls does it really good because it's almost like that stuff is there if you're looking for it. But if you just want to fight and beat the game, you can do that too.
exactly. So it gives players an opportunity to express themselves in terms of how they digest the story that's being told to them, but without kind of hitting you over the head with it. I mean, another great game that does this would be the Infamous games from the PS3 era. Infamous 1 and 2 in particular,
Yeah.
the overarching story is always the same. Like, you're playing as Cole McGrath, you go and, I forget what the bad guy's name was, but you're basically just trying to liberate the city
Yeah.
from this corporate um, overlord. But the way you go about doing it affects how the public views you. If you veer more heroic, then, people will start throwing rocks at bad guys and stuff, but if you veer more, villainous, the people are gonna be terrified of you and maybe even attack you on sight and things like that. Again, not things that necessarily, change the story, but that give you a little bit more, control over the context of how the story is presented to you.
And it's interesting because Demon Souls was kinda like the first so in a way, I mean, there's, like, prior games that are similar, and that was a PS3 title as well. And
Exactly.
even Dragon's Dogma came out on PS3, so it was even in that era where even if they weren't first party, they were starting to get into it's almost emergent gameplay, but a little less than that. You know how sometimes we talk
Yeah,
about the emergent gameplay, and that's I think more strictly gameplay driven. It is contextual, but contextual in terms of gameplay mechanics. Whereas what you're
right.
talking about is very it's almost
It's like
it's
the
almost like
story focused
you.
versus systems
Yeah.
focused. Yeah.
'Cause it could be that as a player, you are finding these other narrative sort of things, but it doesn't affect you because the gameplay is the same, but it could be for someone that they are, like, enthralled by what's happening.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And King Dylan actually just brought up another, great example from that era was BioShock.
Oh, yeah.
That was
Yeah.
another game that, like, um yeah, I mean, you play through the story and it's got, like, kind of a you correct me if I'm wrong, I never actually finished, the first BioShock, but it's like you do have, like, an option at the end of
Yeah, I
which
think
route
there's
you wanna go.
and I think there's even things along the way because it has to do with those little sisters or
Right,
whatever.
you got the sisters and the
Yeah.
big daddies, and you choose whether you, like, harvest the sisters, so yeah, that again, that's a great example of that. But again, we're talking about games that came out from the 360 and PS3 era. And so what is it that's missing from the modern narrative titles? And I think, someone mentioned it earlier. Yes, 16XA Second said older games had to use creative, ways to get around limitations of their time. New games just drop 150 gigabytes of textures and think that the visuals make everything. And I think that there's some truth to that, right? If
Yeah.
you look at, what is it, like the new Hellblade and, like, Forspoken is another game that, like, incredible graphic fidelity, these games that they look like real people, the uncanny valley, aspect of it is crazy. But, yeah, the story just doesn't seem very compelling. I'm thinking about, like, Horizon. I only played,
Mm.
Horizon Zero Dawn. Did you play both of the Horizon games?
I did, I never played through them completely, but it was just to try it out, and from that,
Yeah,
it's like, neither gameplay nor narrative was there, even though they were both interesting, but it's and so this could answer that question, like,
yeah,
I think there's a couple differences. I think one is you know, as a whole humankind on Earth, and I think I talked about this before about something else, like a collective consciousness. So when it comes to gaming, it's almost like there are some, like, assumptions already made when
sure.
someone's playing a game or assumptions not made. For instance, nowadays gaming is more mainstream, so there's a lot more simplifying or hand holding, which then for people that were, historically into games, they don't feel that much of a gaming connection. And so that there's a disconnect there sometimes.
Yeah, I think you mentioned that, this morning when you were talking about Knights of the Old Republic, where it's like
Oh yeah.
removing the sort of combat and reducing it to just like a turn-based,
Turn-based game.
that
Yeah.
basically Knights of the Old Republic is a tabletop game just made into a video game. That took you out of it because it removed an element of control that
Yeah.
players typically would like to have. The new God of War was a good example of, like,
Yeah.
a little too much hand holding,
Yep.
but what's interesting, and this is, getting a little bit off topic, but that's one of those things that you and I always talk about, like, Nintendo being at the forefront of gaming even when they're not the most they don't have the best graphics, they don't have the best hardware, sometimes they don't even necessarily have the best games, but when you look at, like, the transition from, like, Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword, which was extremely handholdy, to then, like, something like Breath of the Wild where,
Mm.
they took a step back and they were like, "You know what? We're gonna give you 0 instructions. We give you, 'Here's your mission, destroy Ganon, go figure it out yourself.'" Like, and to your point, that's where that emergent gameplay and, like, the playing with systems kind of came into play. You don't get as much of the narrative unless go and hunt down all the memories, but again, that's part of that multi-process story approach where it's like,
Yeah.
if you're playing Breath of the Wild, you have the option to just go and destroy Ganon if you want to.
Mhm.
But if you go through and, like, live all the memories and stuff like, "Oh, I see, he was the Zelda's champion and this," and it's like and all of that story is true regardless of whether you engage with it or not, but it gives you the option of whether or not you want to take that story deeper.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because even out of the PS3 era, we had that Order 1886, I think it was called. Do you remember that game? It was like kind of
No.
the first of like super high-end graphics, kind of like what God of War is and Last of Us is now, and it was yeah, I think you were fighting werewolves, if I'm not mistaken. Unless they were like
Sounds
yeah, I think
cool.
they were werewolves. And it was like, the 1800s was like alternate reality, but it was very much story, story, story. And when there was gameplay, it was very basic gameplay. And that started and I beat the game because it was really short. That's one thing that's missing from these games. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think actually talking through this, I'm realizing what's happening is a lot of developers are trying to cram too much into a game. If you wanna make it narrative focused, you need to lean into that. If you wanna make it mechanic focused, lean into that. So,
Yeah. Oh, man, there was a message from Jam Calex that I wanted to, highlight, but, he
yeah.
deleted it. But no, Johnny Tacoma says it this way, it seems like every game nowadays relies on online multiplayer, and it seems to take away from the story mode or what it could be.
Yeah,
I agree with that.
and so that is interesting too, because I wanna bring up Helldivers 2 real quick because
Yes, I was curious about, if you were gonna mention Helldivers
yeah,
too.
because it's a completely multiplayer game, but this is a conversation I was having, like, on Blue Gamer where it's like, you literally could play it as a single player game, and I think for the audience or to market it like that, all they would have to do in the menu or the UI is have a place where you go to single player because it would be the exact same. They've built in Helldivers 2, they've built all the maps and missions that you play eh, as a single player game if you wanted to.
Yeah.
So all they would need to do for the optics is create a menu that says single player campaign and just grab. I don't know, 15 missions that already exist and just put them in order because
Pretty
when I
much.
was first playing Helldivers 2, I was playing it by myself and I was enjoying like exploring and there was still the story that was going on because it was about the invasion and, liberating a planet. So it's interesting where that is a game where people complain there's no story, but there really is if you want to go and look for it.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to engage with a game like Helldivers 2 at the most basic level, you can just log in, party up and go shoot bugs. But if you want to engage with the story, it's there.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, Jam Kellex reposted. So he was saying Order 1886 was the short, expensive tech demo. Um, which
Yeah.
is funny because that's what a lot of people called Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zeroes, is they said like, "Oh, why are they charging $40 for basically a demo?" And it's like, that belies like, yes, the core story of the game is only 14 minutes. If you play it, like, really well, you can beat that game in 14 minutes.
Wow.
Um, but the optional missions, what you'll find is that they're not as optional as you might think. Now because you haven't beaten the Phantom Pain, I'm not gonna give away
Oh,
well, unless you already know the ending of the Phantom Pain.
I don't, but I don't mind. If it's for the audience, let's do it.
If we're gonna go that route, I don't think it well, suffice to say, let me put it this way. So at the beginning of each one of these missions, in Ground Zeroes, there is a little caption that says a pseudo historical recreation. And it's interesting because obviously the level, like the stage that you're playing in, it's the same level over and over and over again, but it's based on Guantanamo Bay. And there's this like weird pseudo history going on. Like they have prisoners of war there. They're doing like these kind of unethical interrogation
Mm,
tactics and stuff like that. And you're going in and you have these different mission objectives that you have to accomplish, while stealthily infiltrating this facility. But what's interesting is like why the caption? Why this like pseudo historical recreation? Like why do you have to tell me that as the player? And the suggestion there is that the entire game is a training exercise for characters in the Phantom Pain.
mm.
Now I'm going to leave it
That
at that because I don't want to give away, all of the story to you. I,
sounds
I
like a
do want you
Kojima
to
thing.
finish the Phantom Pain.
Well, you know what was also interesting is that came out on PS3.
Exactly.
And so what about Metal Gear Solid 4? Because it seems like where 5 is where it's interesting because 5 is the more even though it was on PS3, was the more modern take on video games. Let's make this open world and, or, sandboxy. What was 4 like?
So 4 was interesting because obviously super narrative driven game.
Okay.
But again, there's so many different ways that you can interact with it, that change how the story progresses. So like for instance, for one thing, I want to go back to that idea of like graphic fidelity and stuff like that because obviously with I think that the Fox engine was first used in Metal Gear Solid 4. And what's interesting is like all those Kojima games, like they always were on the cutting edge of um
Yeah.
the new console that was about to come out, right? So it was like Metal Gear Solid 2 came out on the PS2, Metal Gear Solid 4 came out on the PS3. So there was always like they wanted to utilize the most advanced technology, but there was like a definitive decision to not go super realistic with Metal Gear Solid 4. They were like, we want to make realistic looking characters, but we want to pull it back a little bit because we want to still have that stylized character look. We don't want it to be just face scans. So
Yeah.
it's interesting to me that they went that route when they could have pushed the boundaries on that, and chose not to. But to that point, like to your question, Metal Gear Solid 4 does have, like, that overarching story. It's a super convoluted one, and there's, tons of twists and turns, but there's also this, sort of analysis of what gaming had become, because at that time, the Xbox 360 was really popular, games like Call
Yeah.
of Duty had taken off, first person shooters, the sort of gamification of war, And what's interesting is you have the ability to interact with the war that's going on in Metal Gear Solid 4, where you have like these PMCs and then you have like these guerrillas, and it's like you can actually steer the the outcome of the war by your own actions. So like if you were to go around and you were to like, sabotage some of the PMC's equipment, or if you were to like, kill a couple of their soldiers, the guerrillas will celebrate winning at the end of like a level. And so you're like you have the ability to kind of like steer how and again, it doesn't change the overarching narrative of like, the story's gonna happen regardless, but you can change the outcome of these little individual pieces of it, which make it pretty interesting.
Yeah, that is, I like that. And I don't think I've thought about that much in games where I'm playing it and I know there's an overall story, but then there's this other thing. Because, a lot of times I don't play games for the story, unfortunately. Like, I'm the type where a lot of times I start a game and I press start to skip. Some games that I never did that was like with Halo, because
Yeah,
the way Halo serves the story, not only is it actually pretty interesting and compelling, like a TV show, it's always been like that because the characters are like immediately talking about what needs to be done, and then you're
yeah.
already controlling the character. Um, and then so I think what happened was, and this is where Sony is now. I think the PS2 was super popular, and I think when they were working on PS3, remember, wasn't there something about, unless this was the PS2, wasn't it was gonna, like, do something about Saddam Hussein's, like, nuclear weapons or something, like, they were gonna power terrorist weapons? Like, terrorists could use PlayStations or something to power their weapons. Does that sound
Um,
familiar at all, or
I don't remember that specifically. I
okay.
do recall when the PS2 came out and, like, Metal Gear Solid 2 came out, they had to cut, like, an entire scene out of it because there was,
Oh.
like, this destruction scene of New York City, and it was, like, right after September 11th. They were like, "Yeah, we can't."
Well, yeah, okay, see, that makes sense, and so what then happened with the PS3s, it seems like they were really, and I think this is the case, I'm not saying anything that's not true, they were all in on the power. So then if you
Yeah.
look at the exclusive games they had, one, Heavenly Sword, made by Ninja Theory, looked amazing, and it had the mocap. Oh, the guy that plays in Lord of the Rings, the mocap guy, he
Oh, yeah, Andy Serkis.
yes, he's the
Yeah.
main bad guy in Heavenly Sword. Like, Sony was, like, all in on that, like, high-end graphics, narrative, mocap, because then, yeah, we got Order 1886 or whatever that was called. We got, what and at the same time, Grand Theft Auto was even morphing to be very strong on that narrative-driven front, where the latest Grand Theft Autos I don't play because they're just like, I'm going through this story and I'm like, "Eh,
Yeah.
I mean, that might be cool, but it's not for me."
Well, see, and, sometimes the setting, is something worth taking into account as well as, the gameplay itself. Like, for instance, Skyrim does basically the same thing as Metal Gear Solid 4, where it's like, you have the war going on between the Imperials and the Stormcloaks? Gray Cloaks? Storm something. The Nords and the Imperials. And so, you have this option as the player where you can steer how those interactions, how those battles play out. That's something that you probably couldn't do in Halo because you are on one side, right?
Yeah.
Except in Halo 2, they introduced the Arbiter, and you
Oh,
now have the opportunity to do exactly that, where it's like, and is it any coincidence? Wait, no, Halo 2 was on the original Xbox. I was like, is that any coincidence that Halo 2 was on 360? But no,
but
I
I
don't
I
think
think it's still along that same evolution, you know?
that, yeah, that same. So I think that there is definitely this, and maybe part of it is, you and I have been talking about this in terms of like what we consider an interactive narrative versus an interactive world. So we have like stories that you can kind of steer the way things go, and then you have systems that you can kind of play with, like in open world games that are very physics driven. But what if what it really is it's the same thing? It's just the system that you're interacting with is a story-driven system as opposed to a physics-based system, where it's like you are kind of pulling these levers and knobs and messing around with the different AI that exists in the game, and that is how, you kind of play with it. Whereas, I think it probably started with, like, those Quantic Dream
Oh,
games,
yeah.
things like
Heavy
Heavy
Rain.
Rain
Yeah.
and Detroit.
And that was PS3 also, wasn't it?
And those are, again, narrative games, but then there's, like, no yeah, well, actually, come to think of it, I think that they probably employ that same multi-process story, they just do it by means of, the quick time events, where it's like,
Yeah.
there's not a lot of gameplay, but you really do control the way that events play out based on the decisions that you make.
Yeah, so it really was that, yeah, if we look back at the PS3, that's really what Sony was trying to do. Because I keep forgetting that, what is it called? The Last of Us was on PS3. Like, I keep forgetting that because they
Mm.
keep pushing it on PS4, PS5, but that started with PS3. So, yeah, PS3 was really all about that, um narrative like Sony was all in on the narrative, and we've seen recently how they've had to back off of that because there's like, well, that inflates our budgets. We need a lot more gamey games on our consoles.
Yeah, and, I guess to their benefit and their detriment, because a lot of those narrative-driven games, it's not that they haven't stopped making them, but they've stopped making them well.
Yeah. Um,
Jamcal Hex says, RPGs did it earlier.
yeah, so that's okay. I think that's a good kind of thing that's kind of related because you're right. I think what they did rely on was what we were talking about, like how games are now being handholdy, simplifying. But if you marry that with a narrative game, then you're even doubling down on that sort of
It becomes
non.
way too railroady.
Yes.
Like, you're basically, you might as well, because yeah, I'm trying to think of, like, examples of when you can do things in Horizon that, like, that are different. Like, I feel like a lot of these games, Last of Us Part 2, Horizon, every player is gonna have the exact same experience, because even if they fight, "Oh, well, you fought this boss before you did this one," like, at the end of the day, you're gonna fight all the same bosses. You're gonna do all the same things. But I think that a lot of these games that we've talked about from the PS3 era allowed players to cultivate their own experience of, they all experience the same story, but maybe they experience it slightly different from one another.
Yeah, and that's the thing where I think, with gaming getting so big and having so many different types of games, so many different type of people playing games, I feel like there's really room for all this. I think it's more of just like limiting the budget to do it. I
Yeah.
because I think, yeah, it's that thing where you try to do too much for everybody and you don't do anything for anyone. I think you've said it better, but you know,
No, I think that that's pretty well articulated. Dan says, TTRPGs still do it best. Yes. I think that the quest to create the tabletop role-playing game experience in video games, like, it's the unattainable goal, right? It's like Bandai trying to make the perfect Zeta Gundam model kit.
I
It's
know
they're
it's
gonna keep doing it, but they're not gonna hit the mark. No, and honestly, that's kind of what I would want from a Gundam game, and I know we always fall back on this. It's like, well, it's like I want a systems-driven game that allows you to experience a narrative, but to craft that narrative around your own play style, around your own decisions as a player, so that everyone kind of can make of the game what they want of it.
yeah.
Um, yeah, and to your point, you don't need to make what they call a 60-hour game. What's interesting is, I think, you were talking about this on your show the other day, where it was like, "Oh, that we've determined that this game is 12 hours long," and it's like, "Well, 12 hours long for who?" Because,
Right.
how do you measure a game in length of hours played? You can't.
Yeah, especially how people play games completely differently. Like some people don't need to max their character. Some
Yeah.
people don't even watch all the cutscenes. Let's say there's a game where a third of it is cutscenes. There's so many different things. And this almost goes to also, I forget if we talked about this, but like difficulty in games, like
Yeah.
how sometimes it's even where you select the approach of gameplay versus narrative also, which it's interesting that those are options. It's like on one hand, it's good there's options. On the other hand, how much then are you potentially making a version of your game available to people that's not what you wanted out there? Y you know,
Yeah, that's
you know
true. I mean, well, okay, so Jam Calix brought up, Baldur's Gate 3, which I know was like if it was not game of the year, it was a game of the year contender. That one I heard was very
Is
popular
that
as
the newest one?
yeah.
Yeah, that I think some places that was game of the year. That
Now,
was yeah.
so my question is, do the choices in that and this reminds me of, like, Mass Effect came up in chat earlier as well, and I'm a big fan of the Mass Effect series, but I have to say, like, you know, even those games and, like, a lot of the BioWare games, beyond being able to choose who your romantic partner is, do you really get to, like, change the story of how things happen? I mean,
That's
I
interesting.
I think, if we were to if we were to cite an example from Mass Effect 2, um, this is a perfect example of that multi-process story. So Jack, the character from Mass Effect 2, is this, super powerful biotic. You rescue her from this prison, and her loyalty mission, because every character has like their loyalty mission that you can, optionally carry out. Her loyalty mission is that you have to go back to the facility where she was trained as a kid and destroy it because she was tortured there, she was experimented on, she was like this child soldier that they were turning into this weapon. But when you go there, the story is revealed that like she was the chosen one of all of the kids there. They like basically treated her the best, and like all of the other kids were basically just there to be fodder for her to like beat up on. And so it completely challenges her narrative about who she was, and she was like, "No, no, like, you don't understand, they treated me the worst out of everyone." And it's like, "No, no, no, you were actually, like, the test subject. Everybody else was just there to serve your needs." And so, it's one of those things where it's an optional quest. You can go through the entire story not knowing the truth about Jack's past, but by doing that mission, it recontextualizes it. Now, I think where it kind of goes off the rails is when you don't do those loyalty missions, and spoiler alert for those of you who have not played Mass Effect 2, anybody who you don't do the loyalty mission for is like first on the chopping block when it comes to the ending where there's like all these
People die.
unscripted deaths. Like,
Oh, that's interesting.
yeah,
See,
so
that's cool. I like something like that.
it is. And like and again, doesn't change the overall
Yeah.
narrative of the story. I'm not talking about multiple endings. I'm not talking about like, oh, well,
It's
you got the
hey,
good ending or the bad ending. It's like it just changes what the ending means to you.
and this completely perfectly explains Gundam manga versus anime where
Yeah.
there's little differences, but the ending is usually the same. It's and that's neat. That's
Yeah, and I love that stuff. I know that there's always that argument about the canonicity of different one-year war stories, especially now with like Requiem for Vengeance coming out. People were like, "Whoa, what are these Zaku's? Like, what's the all this stuff?" And it's like, well, you know, maybe this is just another person's point of view. To paraphrase Obi-Wan Kenobi, like everyone experienced the one-year war differently. We all know that it ends at a Baoku, but like here was Shiro's experience of the
yeah.
one-year war. And who knows, maybe even like maybe the goof custom as we know it was actually just a goof that he sees differently than Amuro sees it. You know what I mean? Like there's all this
Yeah,
like
exactly. It's like this perspective of the narrator of based on their perspective of the situation they're in, you know?
exactly. And it's something that like Western audiences typically struggle with, like that idea of perceptive reality versus what we call canon, right?
Yeah, I think that plays into, not to get political, but sort of the materialist nature of the West. I think that's really a part of that. It labels are the same thing, where there's the fighting online about, oh, if you're not with this, you're with that.
Yeah,
You
pretty
know,
much.
another game that I think fits this perfectly. Do you remember Spec Ops: The Line?
Is that the one that I'm thinking of where you're playing as the soldier and
It has some, like, choices you can make, but you don't know if you're out of your mind, and it was like, did you just shoot innocent people or not? Like, there's something about that, like,
yeah.
where you I forget, I was trying to look up real quick to see what it was, but it was one of those things where it's almost like the game is telling you you have to do something, and you then realize you made a huge mistake. But
Yeah.
it's almost like, here's if you didn't pay attention to the story, you'd think you're just playing a game. But then the game is telling you, like, "This was bad," you know?
Yeah. And I think that that one kind of that example typically kinda hits you a little too hard over the head with it, where it's like, "Oh, yeah, you were secretly the bad guy the whole time."
Yeah.
I think that and it comes off as a little bit ham-fisted, like the story that they're trying to tell, but it's a very important distinction that you're bringing up because basically that is how video games play out, right? It's like they hand you a gun and they say, go
Oh,
capture
yeah.
target. You know,
Oh,
it's like
yeah.
that is the primary objective of like first person shooters. And that's where it's like that codification, no pun intended, Call of Dutyification of gaming, where it's like, Call of Duty, Helldivers, Fortnite, all of these online multiplayer games where it's just like, I'm gonna log in, I'm gonna capture the point, I'm gonna log in, I'm gonna play team deathmatch. It's like there's no story there unless you want to make it there, I guess.
Right.
Like you said, you can engage with the story of Helldivers. There's not really much story to engage with in Fortnite.
It's yeah, that's funny because with Fortnite, I noticed, like, my youngest was doing something where, like, they would it's like playing with toys, but they would do it
Yeah.
in Fortnite. So they had, like, "This is what's gonna go on, wear this skin, I'll wear this skin, this is what we're" and I was like, "That's really neat." That's what
Well,
makes
like,
those
clearly people are craving that. Like,
yeah.
they're craving that storytelling aspect of the game. It's just
Well, Rockstar or Take-Two, I forget which one, bought the people making those narrative mods for GTA, like, wasn't it, like, some tabletop, like,
I
thing,
think so.
and then they tried to shut it down, but then they just bought them so that it could be integrated with the next game. So that yeah, so I think, like, even though I have been disappointed by how Sony has been pushing these narrative-driven games, you're right into where I think they can still work. It's just, um it's like that whole all-in aspect. It's like,
Yeah.
we'll make this type of game, but we'll make it so it works for everybody, and you can't do that.
Yeah, I mean, it can't be so open-ended that it's just is meaningless, there needs to be some sort of stakes involved, there needs to be some kind of, like, core story, but giving the player a little bit of agency, giving the player an option to engage with the story in different levels, I think that's where it's kinda missing. Like you said, we've gotten a little too handholdy, both in gameplay and the storytelling, where it's like, at this point, I don't really feel any compelling desire to play a video game so much as just watch the cutscenes and be like, "Oh, I just watched a 90-minute movie. It's fine." Like
That was exactly with, Hellblade 2 because I wanted to give it a shot, and as I was playing, I was like, "Well, I'm not enjoying myself. This isn't bad, but this is just not for me. I'm not gonna just spend my time with it then." And so but I think that's just what's cool about video games like it is with, like, movies and TVs shows where there's things for people and things that are not for people, and, I mean, I think that's just how it's gonna be, but I think the publishers or, like, Sony have to figure this out and make
Yeah.
sure that they are making the games for who they're to be made for, not that only certain people can play certain games, so it's only certain people want to play certain games.
Right, and by diversifying your game library and to sit there and say like, "Okay, well, we have these 3, dev groups that, like, one of them is making, the next Fortnite clone. This one's gonna make the next Fortnite clone, and then that one's gonna make, like, the next Fortnite clone." Instead of doing that, we say like, okay, here's the demographic that we're trying to capture with this, live service game. Here's the demographic that we're trying to capture with this medieval fantasy story game. And here's the demographic that we're trying to capture. It's like by diversifying their target audience instead of trying to target everybody with everything and diversifying their offering of game types, they can actually win win bigger. you
Yeah, and
know
that's actually I don't know if, you've heard this, but they've said that recently,
Yeah.
where I think it was that new the temporary CEO?
Yeah,
I forget his name, but I think he was kinda saying, "Yeah, we need to diversify." That's why they, like, in that Black Myth Wukong, for instance, I don't know the reasoning, but apparently that's an exclusive temporarily on PlayStation. And I think that's what they're trying to do. What are the things that people are resonating with online, and can we get some sort of deal while Xbox owns Call of Duty? So
pretty
yeah,
much.
but I think that's good. I think this is an example of just because a publisher might be failing at something, sometimes that's good because then they're going to come around the other side and be like, okay, we need to change things up. Like
Yeah.
we need to change things up, and then that's kind of a win for everybody because 'cause they're trying to figure out and you've brought this up before where, like, a corporation, it's like there's a service they provide, how much in them are they really wanting to provide a service or just make money, you know?
Right,
And I
yeah.
think we're at the part where Sony is like, "Okay, we need to make sure we have a diversified library of fun games."
Yeah, and not try to go all in on the
The
next
narrative.
Spider-Man game.
Or
Like
yeah. And that's the thing with the Spider-Man game because it would and I forgot if we touched on this, but there'd be times in the Spider-Man game where you would just be walking for a long time talking about something that happened before, and then it makes you play the gameplay of before, and it's like, "Well, that's not really what I wanted to do with this game." Yeah, or it makes you play as Mary Jane, and you're just doing stealth missions. You're like, "That's not why I bought Spider-Man."
right, yeah, there's and again, like, it's trying to kind of cater to multiple audiences in a single title, which then, to your point, bloats the game's size because, shoot, how many gigs was Spider-Man, like, when you
Yeah.
downloaded it? It's like 120 or something like that,
Yeah, it's
and
insane.
then it bloats the budget because now instead of just having, 2 to 3 guys writing a Spider-Man story, you have to have a team of 20 people talking about like, "Okay, well, here's what the story is gonna be for this side mission, and, like, when you play as this character, and, you have to do all these different things," which then just makes more work for the devs because 'cause they're like, "Hey,
Yeah.
I just programmed all of Spider-Man's movements, and now you want me to, like, animate Mary Jane sneaking around?" Like
Yeah, and that's interesting because you then wonder how much of that maybe inflates a budget that didn't need to be and would be a bigger win. And I was doing research on this, and apparently budgets budgets of games are only known if revealed.
Hmm,
So, like,
interesting.
Microsoft said they spent 500,000,000 on Halo Infinite on purpose. Part of at first because they thought it was gonna be good. And part of that was the infrastructure for Game Pass, you know?
Yeah.
Um, so the other thing too is I was looking at, like, for instance, the Marvel vs. Capcom, games are not gonna be on Xbox. I was wondering, okay, what's the budget on that? Because maybe that's just a matter of we don't wanna pay for a port, even though it could happen. But there's that petition that went out of people wanting to get it ported, which I hope wins because that's just a win for us. But,
Yeah.
um,
Can only
yeah,
be good.
yeah, it's just it's interesting, yeah, just where everything's gone,
Yeah,
you
and
know?
it's not even like, y you know he it's very telling that, like, with Helldivers 2 and with a game like Metal Gear Solid Ground Zeroes, both 40 bucks, like, you can get AAA game quality for a $40 price tag, and that's coming from a Kojima studio, like, well, way back in the day, so, like, obviously, there was, um,
Well,
you know
and speaking of Kojima, I'm excited about this new Metal Gear because it looks fantastic, but Kojima, isn't involved. But
Right.
it looks like it would be a modern release, even though it's a remake, but still,
Yeah, I mean, they kind of rebuilt it from the ground up, and they
yeah,
actually I've been watching a lot of the trailers around it and stuff like that. They have so you can play using sort of the modern, control styles, like what you've experienced in, like,
uh,
Metal Gear Solid 5, or you can play with the traditional top-down camera the way that it was played on the PS2. So it's like
that's
you
cool.
have and this kind of plays into the idea where it's like you craft the game the way that you play it, the same way that
Yeah,
you would craft the game in terms of narrative and how much you engage with one of Kojima's,
stuff.
convoluted stories.
Yeah,
So,
that's
I
cool.
mean, I think that there's definitely like you said, I think that especially with this news of so many remakes and PS3 games coming to PS5, like, there's clearly an acknowledgement that there are certain things about game design from the early aughts that are kind of resurfacing and becoming, popularized again, at least among publishers. I don't think that they were ever not popular among gamers. Like,
Right.
I think that that's kind of the funny thing is, the very fact that retro gaming is so popular and that people are still playing these older games instead of, newer titles indicates that,
Yeah, and it makes me wonder how much of this is newer gamers interested in the old stuff. That's something I really wanna find out. Are we still in this, like, generational overlap where maybe in 15 years, there's gonna be no more Atari or Genesis stuff as that it's as interesting? I wonder, yeah.
that'll be curious. Curious to see. But that's about all that I had for today. I think we pretty much kind of explored all of the different things that are plaguing the gaming industry. See, basically, like you and I we just need an hour to sit down and we can solve all the problems with the gaming industry.
Yeah, exactly, man, and we're working on it behind the
We are.
scenes.
Yeah.
One day.
Yeah, you guys, you got some surprises coming your way.
Yeah.
But yeah, until then, or well, yeah, well, until then, until tomorrow when we've got the Gundam Explain show, I'm
Oh,
probably,
yeah.
like I said, I'm probably gonna hop on and stream some more of the Gunpla build. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with us and indulging us on this talk. Thank you for bringing up some examples yourselves because again, I think that this community knowledge that we all have, where it's like we can all contribute examples of like, "Oh, yeah, that is an idea that I saw explored in this game that, they're talking about." This is where I think the rubber meets the road in terms of, like, publishers actually getting the message. Because I feel like when you've got these boardrooms and you've got these teams of developers that are just like, "Alright, we need to make the next live service game."
Yeah, they're making business decisions
Yeah.
at that, yeah. Good talk, man. This is always good.
Yeah, I love these ones.
Yeah.
So thank you guys so much. Hope you all enjoy the rest of your Wednesday, and if I don't see you tonight, we will see you tomorrow.
See y'all.